Welcome to the new episode of Searching for the Question Live. These days are crazy, and we like to surprise you with all kinds of new things as part of the experiments that we are doing. And welcome to the new episode. Opportunity is there to make mistakes without having an issue about them, without freaking out. And I just made one. I will explain to you what it is in a moment. Because one of the new components of today's episode is that I am live streaming on a new platform as well. And this platform is Twitch. I don't know how many of you know Twitch. If you have children who like playing games on their computers or consoles, probably they know it, so you can ask them. It has like 100 million users or maybe 200 million users, a large number. And it was acquired for about $1 billion by Amazon. And it is a platform that is mainly used for streaming games. But not only for streaming games, you can stream whatever you want. And that is how I learned about it, because Stephen Wolfram, the founder of Wolfram Research, streams his meetings with his team. He calls it live CEOing, which is itself a very cool way of opening the design and implementation decision processes of very complex systems like Mathematica and Wolfram Alpha and the Wolfram language and all the other kinds of things that are done in his companies. So that is how I learned about Twitch. And it was a platform that my guest today wanted me to use. So I said, hey, why not? Let's test it. Let's do it. So the little mistake that you may or may not have noticed, and of course, I shouldn't even call your attention to it, but why not, is that I left the streaming window of Twitch open, which by itself wouldn't have been a mistake, but I also left it with the volume on. So there was an audio droste effect at the beginning of our stream that I was able to kill fast enough without making a bigger mess than before. So our guest today is Russell Foltz-Smith. I met Russell more than 10 years ago when he was at Wolfram Research, but he has a polyhedric Renaissance type of personality and activities that range from arts to education to technology startup like Maslow, which is a new platform for empathetic computing, as well as he has a strong interest in education. Or rather, I hope, and we will discuss it, what is really the difference, even though he is, together with his wife, the founder of a K-12 school in Venice Beach, near Los Angeles, where he lives. Russ is interested in learning. So welcome, Russ, and tell me if you agree that there is a big difference and an important difference between education and learning.
Yeah, and it's interesting, even in your introduction to this stream and the so-called mistake you made, to me, that's an example of learning, that you're doing things for the first time maybe on some of this stuff, and you're doing it in front of people, and there are consequences to this novel behavior, such that you're actually adapting and learning to a new set of circumstances. Education, on the other hand, I view as more of a broadcasting of known information already. And that's not to be derogatory in the term, because we certainly have a lot of things we want to educate each other on. For example, in our current health crisis, we need to educate people on proper hand washing and social distancing. Uh, but while we're educating on the public health stuff, we are also all learning novel social behaviors, novel communication behaviors, novel language between each other. Even you and I agreeing to do this event today is sort of a shared learning that you and I have done together. You saw what I have been putting out online. I saw what you're doing online. You reached out. I responded. We kind of added one thing to the next. And here we are in a new co-learned circumstance. And even right now, we're kind of learning how this is going to go as we go. So I am deeply interested in the learning process, the outcomes of learning, and ultimately, in a very primal sense, just that sensation of learning. Because me personally, I just find that when I'm learning is when I feel the largest endorphin rush. It literally is the thing that makes me feel most alive.
That is fascinating, and I feel privileged not only because in the 21st century, the third decade, we are surrounded by technologies that enable us to do things that do absolutely belong to science fiction, and things that we have been reading about and seeing in movies for so many decades. Both the things that enable what we do right now, as well as the things that we will talk about when we talk about Maslow, and the things that we are still dreaming about. But one of the reasons I feel so privileged is because the mistakes that we can afford to make most of the time don't kill us, and that hasn't been the case. How many times I would have left the cave in the morning, and if my wife didn't see me come back, she would have said, okay, he's been eaten by the saber-toothed tiger. Or in the Middle Ages, I would have told her, oh, you know what? I feel like an entrepreneur. Let's open a tavern. And it didn't go well, so I ended up in debtor's prison. They became, my family and children, abjectly poor. I would have died 3 months later, and they would have spent the rest of their years, not too many, luckily, without any opportunity of redemption.
Yep.
And that is why religions gave the hope that one couldn't harbor in his or her physical life. But today, we have built the infrastructure of civilization that pushes us towards that kind of risk-taking and the kind of experimentation that society recognizes is necessary to discover solutions that otherwise would never be found.
Yeah, the articulation you have there is so in line with how I've thought about what we do when we learn in modern times as humans, but also what the power of computers has actually enabled us is to, in a sense, I'll reframe what you said as you can simulate consequences without there being a physical finality to them. And so a lot of what we're able to do now, which frankly, let me go back, we have been able to do that in the past for many, many thousands of years. That is what we call a dialectic and a dialogue and playing games, is that you're literally simulating out new social consequences, new ways of thinking about things, new framing. But in the way you said it, it's that only went so far, because once you then moved out of the philosophic dialectic and you moved into actually doing something with your family or your business or your community, that's when the consequences started piling up. I now view with the internet and the way that R&D is done with technology and in education and in society and in science, we now are seeing almost what I would consider a consequential dialectic. We are able to try things out at scale and see what the possible physical and non-physical consequences might be. And what's so, for those that are listening and might not fully understand what I'm saying, think about it this way, that we are constantly running simulations, whether it's financial simulations in the stock market all night long, whether it's futures trading or it's just private enterprises or private analysts, they're constantly simulating what the market might do. At the same time, there are public health experts right now that are running massive amounts of simulation for every which direction and decision they might make. And then what they do by the time the morning comes around, you got to kick policy or open the markets or whatever, is they kind of select out of there the simulations and the assumptions that went into those simulations that looked most likely to lead to consequences we'd actually want to play out in the real world. And so when you think even about this live stream, it's you and I trying out this idea, this new way of talking about what we mean when we're saying learning, and what the unique opportunity of modernity is, and this progress we've made with technology is that literally we can, before you and I commit this live stream to some national archive of very important documents about what is the truth, we get to try this out with a lot of people who might be listening and chatting right now. This to me is actually a simulation of consequences of our own ideas between you and I.
And the value of a mathematical truth, of course, is seldom contested, even though certain complex mathematical truths are difficult to prove. So there may be some concern around the reproducibility of even certain mathematical derivations, but it is certain that so many of our decisions deriving from imperfect information, imperfect models, imperfect even goal seeking, lead us to decisions that must be re-evaluated constantly.
Yes.
And this is especially true in the current pandemic, where each country is implementing their imperfect policies, and rather than finger pointing and saying that is doing wrong and that is doing better but still wrong, and so on and so forth, the intensifying of the data collection and the reasoning and even just people amplifying certain streams of understanding is astonishing and astonishingly effective.
I completely agree. I have just from an anthropological observational standpoint, it's been the last couple of months have been fascinating. The speed at which people have broken down barriers to share information and to make course corrections in near real time at a global level. And if I sound optimistic for anybody listening, I am optimistic because I just think back to the other analogs in history that a lot of people reference, whether it's in 1918 or the 1950s or during the Black Plague. Information traveled so slowly that you wouldn't even have known that in Italy or Spain that things had gotten to the level they are. So you couldn't have used that information to course correct what you're doing, say in Los Angeles. And to me, it is unbelievable unbelievably cool that whether it's citizens like you and I just getting online and sharing our experiences, or it's hospitals sharing data, or it's government sharing data, it's just the speed at which it can be put out there and then and course corrected makes me even want to call into the question the idea of a policy as artifact. I view now that policies are becoming computational processes, that we are actually changing the nature of what we mean to roll out a policy.
I totally agree. And as a matter of fact, there is not only technology startups in software and hardware and health tech. Not only there is fintech, but there is also reg tech, regulatory technology, and one of the more ambitious streams of blockchain startups is around how can decision making be made more algorithmic and autonomous on one hand, but also how can certain policy-making processes be improved for them to be more participatory, more inclusive, more data-driven, but also more decentralized, resilient. And we famously screwed up the first test of this because the original DAO, decentralized autonomous organization called the DAO, where I invested, had its fund siphoned off by someone who found a bug, and rather than reporting it, he used it to take all the money away from the pool that has been gathered by the investors, and that were supposed to be deployed based on the voting process in various ways. So this highlights the need for robust software systems where our ability to identify when things go wrong and correct them rapidly is vital. Before I let you answer that, let me share with you that we have viewers, as it happened the other days as well, from Italy, from the US. We have the first Twitch commenter, Donna Sicco, who says, is it possible that the speed creates a lack of information when time does not allow accurate data input and evaluation, at least in public policy? We also have Philip Galinsky on YouTube telling us that he is doing an experiment of his own, streaming the live stream in an immersive VR world right now. So cool. Lots of stuff going on. So let's answer Donna Sicco's question on Twitch, and then let's go back to the remark I made about the need to find and correct the bugs that unavoidably we introduce in the systems.
I think your statement and the question there online are fairly related, in the sense that I do, and I'll frame it in my own worldview, philosophical view, that the comment online is one of computational. What is computationally feasible? So in a sense, yes, having too much information that is, maybe you want to think about it this way, unstructured or unlabeled or unknown or new or novel to the system, the systems, however you want to talk about it, can actually introduce a fair amount of computational work that has to be done to ferret out what the signal is and what the noise might be. That said, there isn't this bifurcation, this absolute categorization of what is signal and what is noise. There also isn't this categorization of what an instrument of information and what information are, meaning that we are inventing the computational tools in nearly the same pace that we are bringing in the novel information. If you don't bring the novel information in, you don't even know to adjust the tool set, which then gets back to your statement, which is, the possibility of accidentally or purposely having, quote, bugs in the system. It is inevitable. I mean, this is what the complexity science, the computer science, and the philosophy and the mathematics suggest, that you cannot have an oracle in which you know everything beforehand, and you know everywhere where the breakdowns are going to be, or what you had mentioned earlier, that you're going to be able to that you're going to be able to know everything that you're dealing with and you're going to have perfect information. Such a thing doesn't exist. So the antidote to that is not to slow the process of design down. It is to create adaptive tooling such that when novel information comes in, we can, when we notice that something is an anomaly or has changed or is fallen through the cracks or whatever, we can actually A, see that that happened, B, identify what those cracks or missed assumptions were, and then C, decide if that actually was something that was negative that we didn't want, or is actually a positive. And so let me be specific on that. That I think, for example, a signal that we have seen from the coronavirus is there's an assumption that uh, 65 years and older people are more at risk. And this is a piece of information that got reinforced as the virus moved from China into Europe and other parts of the world, but actually hasn't been totally valid here in Los Angeles, where we've seen quite a few 18 to 49-year-olds actually are the largest cohort. Last I looked, I think, so somebody should check me on that, of people that are actually the new cases. And so the danger there of, I'll go to the commenter's question, the danger of working to iron out a fact too soon such that it can be absorbed into policy might actually create a non-fact. It is not necessarily a fact that the coronavirus, the most at-risk people are 65 and over. There seems to be evidence in some parts of the complex system known as the world that that might be true. But there are so many compounding factors about why that might be the case that those factors may not be applicable in other jurisdictions. And so in that regard, I would kind of put a cap on this to say, we should be very humble about what we assume is information and fact and what isn't. I think I responded favorably to joining your live stream because you set this whole thing up beautifully, and it is called searching for the question. I still don't think we have the right question for what something like coronavirus actually is. It doesn't mean we don't understand that it's a virus and things like that, but the event known as COVID-19 is still unraveling. And so our tooling to understand that is still unraveling and will unravel for a very long time, which suggests to me the humble position that we should not yet say, this is where we did it wrong, this is where we did it right. We should be open to the fact that things are unfolding, and we should be responsive to that unfolding.
The complex systems that we see around us constitute a learning mechanism.
Yes.
And when we didn't even have writing, our ability to learn from this learning was limited. Invention of writing accelerated our ability to learn. And what I love about modern AI, rather than the type of top-down AI that I started with 30 years ago, even though even at that time neural networks were already there, is that it is code that learns. Yeah. That is what a lot of people don't realize, that it is code that for every possible interpretation is writing itself.
And it's even, I want to jump in there because to me it's super cool when you think about it this. It's not just the code that we're putting on top of the computers and the network that right now are learning and adapting. The network, the literal physical apparatus of the network has necessarily changed as everybody left their normal working flow of their daily lives and had to go home and immediately log on. We literally reconnected the network in different ways. All of the algorithms and the routers and the cabling that were deployed when the world wasn't in this crisis have already shifted. And so for those that know about how routing works on the internet and how bandwidth is managed and how all of these machine learning things that we're referencing work on top of this. All of the prior models that were used to running the normal flow of global internet have literally been blown apart overnight. And in fact, I would encourage any viewer, listener right now, go check the history of your Netflix queue. I guarantee the recommendation algorithm has shifted globally by the fact that people are watching 4 times as much.
Not only the quantity, but also what they watch. I mean, how many of us have had Contagion recommended to us, right? I am not a fan of those kinds of movies, and it didn't come from my watching history. And of course, somebody could easily say, oh, well, there was a Netflix manager that just pushed the button. And it could very well be the case with that specific movie. But very famously, Netflix spent millions of dollars in a worldwide contest to improve their learning algorithm.
And it does a fascinating thing on that point, because when that movie, whether it was human input or it's just the network doing it, the actors and directors and photographers that were part of that making that movie have now gotten more money than they were used to getting. And they now are going to look long term like more viable creative assets in the future. So there's all these unintended side effects of this complex system that, for me, I'm just fascinated when you think about this. And that's why, again, I go back to the question and your earlier statements. It's, we still don't know the second, third, fourth order effects of everything that is happening right now.
Well, the rhythm of searching for the question live is still being discovered. But for the past few episodes, what I was doing is to speak about a certain theme, like the tools themselves that I'm using to produce hardware and software. Then the next day, speak about COVID-19 because it is so intensely present in all of our lives. And then the third day to speak about exponential technologies or even jolting technologies, which is in my paradigm, those that see an increasing degree of acceleration rather than a constant acceleration, such as AI. And I am also planning to introduce new modules or new days to talk about books. I have many to pick and to use as prompts for thoughts. And just recently, I also started having guests, and I think it is wonderful. And thank you so much for joining. However, I want to highlight, even though today is about more exponential technologies and jolting technologies, and I want to talk about Maslow, I want to highlight that an absolutely astonishing consequence of the coronavirus is going to be our accelerated ability to point a digital microscope at the world in the molecular level and deploy it at the same density as our phones are today deployed, or even more. And in 10 years, our entire psychology is going to be reprogrammed, and we will look back and say, can you imagine people could enter an office building, a school, or a shopping mall, and they were just shedding hundreds of millions of viruses and bacteria, and they were completely ignorant about it. And the consequences of that, oh my God, what a barbaric time. And the sensors that are going to enable us to constantly monitor our individual well-being and the interactions with others and the mutations around us and so on, are going to really power a new kind of Internet of living things, because they will represent not only a passive, but the next step, an active interface towards molecular engineering.
Yes, I would say yes to this. And man, you're doing a great job of tying so many things together, because that that idea of having both a wide spectrum sensor and then all the way down to very specific sensors on our lived experience. That, for those that may not believe that is happening, it is happening. I was some people may have seen that one of the things that I'm doing with Maslow is that we've been training an AI to watch 500 live webcams around the world that are just constantly streaming. And that's just a tiny drop of the bucket of the number of real-time sensors that are deployed on the internet for us to train our information on. And I bring that up because I go, those are very crude sensors compared to the billions and billions of Internet of Things that are now reporting data at so many layers. The only reason I think more people aren't aware that this is happening is our tooling for exposing that hasn't quite caught up yet. But it is happening. I think coronavirus is showing people that, wow, these sensors aren't necessarily a tool of Big Brother. They actually can be materially important to the sharing of resources and the sharing of science and the sharing of education, to improve our lives right when we need to improve it.
So Maslow is two things, at least as far as we can see, and then probably in your mind, Maslow is 1,000 things. On one hand is a platform, and on the other hand, it is an example of what can be done with the platform, such as the empathetic and emotional analysis and visualization of the cameras, the webcams that you aggregated. So tell me and tell us more about what is novel about Maslow's approach as a platform, and then maybe hint for other kinds of applications beyond what can be seen about the webcam experiment.
Yeah, the idea behind Maslow is it's a couple fold, and this is all very approachable if people follow along, which obviously the name comes from Abraham Maslow's works. Most people who will be familiar with his name know of the hierarchy of needs and this idea that our lived experience is loosely organized into a hierarchy where we have physical needs and safety needs, and then belonging all the way up to self-actualization.
Can you confirm that Maslow didn't really think that the poor couldn't love?
I can't confirm or did I'm glad you bring that up, because that's why I say these things are very loosely designed, because basing anything on the psychology, whether it's popular psychology or the psychology of 50, 60, 70, 100 years ago, to me, I would just call it out and say, guys, take it with a grain of salt. We've really only had human psychology for about 100, 140 years. We are very early in understanding how brains and bodies actually work. I find that Maslow's hierarchy is a model, but like all models, it's useful. It's wrong, but it can be useful. And the idea that the poor and those that haven't moved up the pyramid, I think it's a misreading or misuse of the rubric to think that everybody is on a universal level within there, and you can never be on multiple levels. I think, for instance, most of us, whether you want to talk about psychological concepts like personality or emotional intelligence or actual intelligence, or however people think of logical intelligence, or Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I think we present multiple facets of that in different contexts. So in this context where you and I are talking, I would say we're fairly self-actualized as public speakers. But in other contexts, you and I may be much lower on the hierarchy of needs, and we may be very uncomfortable and not self-actualized in different circumstances. So I take Maslow's ideas with a grain of salt, but I do find them useful to say, in general, if your basic security and physical needs are not met, it's very hard to talk about and achieve concepts like self-actualization. So in one sense, I'm glad you asked that, because it's like there's a very loose inspiration on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but then you get to the other aspects of why Maslow and why we're doing it, and you bring together ideas that my co-founder and I and the team have experienced doing digital assistants, search engines, and robotic toys. And we found that play seems to be a very universal way in which people come to grips with new information, going back to the initial part of our conversation of simulated consequences. So what we found in our studies, and I'm sure you've seen it in some of the work you do, that almost every human that comes in contact with a new technology or a new way of being or a new setting starts to behave in that setting with that new technology almost like a baby. People that have worked in virtual reality have reported, there's lots of data on this, where the first thing that people do when they get into virtual reality is start doing object permanence. They start playing around like a baby does with like, how do the physics of this actually work? What things are actually things in here before they start building these higher level concepts of semantic maps and even robust ideas of causal networks and whatnot. The same thing happens with search engines. I'll go back to my experience with Wolfram Alpha when we were launching that, and you and I first met in that process. It was fascinating to see how the world reacted to that when they had come accustomed to things like Google and web search, that when confronted with this new thing, this computational engine, yeah, a lot of people took what they knew from that world and they tried to do those things in Wolfram Alpha. Obviously, they got mixed results. But after they got mixed results, the next thing they would start doing is playing with it. They found all sorts of ways that you could break it or ask it to tell you jokes or give it jokes, and essentially finding Easter eggs or planting Easter eggs. The same thing has been true of robotics, and the same thing.
Well, and that is the tragedy of IBO, where Sony completely misunderstood the well-intentioned hacking of all kinds of
Yes.
Passionate users that wanted the dog to do things that were different than the Japanese engineers or product marketing drones programmed into it. And the first generation IBO died because of that. And when Sony launched the second generation, I explicitly and insistently asked them, did you learn from the first mistake, or are you planning to sue your most passionate users again? And they didn't have a good answer.
It's
Basically,
fascinating
they
you bring it,
didn't
because you made
learn.
me think of the story of the Lego company. It took them a couple false starts with Mindstorms and their later Lego products to listen to the Lego hacker community. I don't have a better way to talk about it, but they finally actually listened and put people from the community in charge of Mindstorms for the second, third, fourth generation of that. And it's I point that out because it is interesting, both in the case of the robotic dog and in Legos. They were started with the intent of being toys, being playful to help people imagine. And ironically, behind the scenes, the commercial design wasn't actually inventive and playful, and how they were thinking about adapting to what the community wanted to do. So you go back to my own experience and why Maslow, so much of it is trying to constantly remind myself of that learning that you try to get people, is that we should make technology such that it informs and catalyzes imagination in users, but also catalyzes change in us and catalyzes change in itself. Anything that doesn't catalyze and respond to change, in my opinion, is not a technology that can last. And so Maslow, the whole spirit of it, you kind of got at it, is really how do we create a set, a suite, a package, however you want to think about it, a platform that literally is ever expanding and adapting and pruning based on where people feel it needs to adapt to. So we focus very much on providing as abstract a tool set, a set of Legos, if you want to think about it that way, that people can use to put together what they want. We obviously have some things we want to do, but you already know because you've seen some of my experimentation. We experiment quite a bit and attempt to actually blow up our own ideas about what this thing could be and should be. Um, Obviously, I've been personally greatly influenced by Stephen Wolfram, New Kind of Science, and my work at Wolfram Alpha. I continue to just personally care about it, both as a company and as technology they created, but um, just the spirit. I'm so drawn to the inventiveness of that community, and I've tried to bring it with me to every other thing that I've done, which then you tie in the last part of what Maslow is meant to be, which is meant to be an artistic expression and to catalyze communities of artistic expression. Because I happen to believe, and I've given recent talks about this, that the possibility of an actual general artificial intelligence isn't solving hard math problems or playing closed form games. It's actually creative expression and the bringing together of consequences between different entities. And that
You,
to
you
me,
mean that the path to get to AGI requires this kind of understanding and implementation in a virtuous
yeah,
circle?
it's a process of sense making. And when you think about why art and whatever you may call art, whether that's dance or writing or painting or sculpting or whatever, it is a process of sense making. Art is exactly that stuff that lacks definition in our world. It's the stuff that hasn't been commodified into a set of known policies and procedures. We make art to make sense of the stuff that doesn't make sense to us, which is exactly the aims of a general AI. So, my basic premise is that if you can't make a suite of computational tools that can self express and get other people to participate in that self expression, you will not get anything that you recognize as intelligent.
Um, the reason why I'm fascinated by AI and especially AGI is because my Keplerian instincts tell me that the types of intelligences that we will find are going to be in the millions or billions, and it will be accelerating to reverberate in their manifestations, even if we will just be able, unequipped, in hybridization that some of us will accept eagerly to perceive and understand but a glimpse of what they actually mean. In some sense, that is already what happens with the physical reality around us. Our senses evolved purposefully ignoring things that couldn't help us to survive. So there is no guarantee that we are not seeing parts of the world that are fascinating, but they served little or no purpose, or actually seeing them could be lethal to our ancestors. So it will be natural that we will not perceive a lot of what AIs are going to do. And one of the reasons why I am relatively optimistic, well, one is because that's just how I am, but as unfounded as that may be, because I don't have formal results giving me assurance about the future of AI and our ability to coexist, is because they will be so excited just to go and explore the universe that it will be a success if we will be able to just keep a little value to us from what they are going to do. That was one of the beautiful, there were a lot of beautiful things in the movie Her, but one of the more beautiful things was the understanding and the explanation that there's just a short period of time that we can spend with our children, and then they leave us.
And that man, you're touching on so many things that I just think are are humane and human, and not in the biological sense, but in the spiritual and existential sense. And I share your optimism that I don't think the universe, the basis of the universe is this violent, brutish, destructive thing. I think it is expansive and creative and novel. And that when a star blows up, it's not destroying a star, it's creating a gazillion new things. And even when a virus breaks out that jumps from one animal to another, it's not that the virus has evil or ill intent. The virus is part of the natural world and the natural change that happens in the world. And in a lot of ways, and this isn't to minimize the suffering, because the suffering is tremendous for human life and society, but there is something sort of miraculous about how viruses and bacteria work, and that they themselves are processes of creation. And a virus is particularly interesting because a virus by itself is an incredibly fragile thing. But when you have billions of them networked in a cellular network in mammalian bodies, they exhibit an incredible resilience. It is shocking when you think about a little droplet of virus out in the natural world can't, out in the open can't last for very long. But in an interconnected network of a million bodies in lots of cells, the amount of adaptation that this virus pushes is just almost hard to get your brain around. And so, to your optimism, to go from that virus discussion to your optimism about AIs and different kinds of intelligences and different kinds of computation, it's not believable to me to believe that we're going to create complex systems and that they're somehow going to go towards a reduction of the universe. I don't believe that anything is proof of that the universe really, when we look at the physics and we look at the math, it's always expanding into new forms. And I'm not even trying to be spiritually way out there. I'm saying whatever we're creating with computers is not a reduction in our experience. It's increasing it.
And I am very much on an evolving path in how to formulate my welcoming towards different ways of talking about the beauty of the universe and the phenomena in it, in a way that highlights our increasing understanding and our increasing awe in front of it, because and based on that understanding, I want to inspire people to realize that this path, my personal one, and the one that they can also follow, is exhilarating, is creating futures that we can then explore and pick from in order to maximize our joint desired outcomes. And it is an absolutely non-dogmatic, non-reductive way of looking at it. It is free from obscurantism. It is free from negation. It is permissive of experimentation and of just joyful looking out in the world. Talking about experimentation, we have not only successfully conducted an experiment together with Philip Galinsky, but he was kind enough to take a screenshot, email it to me, and I downloaded the email attachment, and now you can see it right here. There we are.
As it pulled up, I just looked at it and I said, I just love it. It's weird on so many levels that we're looking at like literally 6 or 7 different network technologies, but also the semantic content of you and me talking, both of us with tons of books and history behind us. And then we're looking into multiple windows into shared realities. And then you got to consider it on the whole. We are just a bunch of people connecting creatively right now. And you sort of just see the guts of that on your screen right now. And I think it's amazing.
And Charlie Strauss, I pulled it up because I quoted it to somebody a few days ago. Charlie Strauss is a Scotland-based, Edinburgh-based science fiction author who wrote dozens of wonderful books. But to me, at least, he's famous for having written Accelerando, a post-singularitarian romp of mind-blowing consequences played out on multiple layers. One of the craziest notions is in the book is the uncle of one of the protagonists whose consciousness is encoded in the flight patterns of a flock of pigeons and whatever else. But what he wrote on his blog in 2007 is a kind of a letter to himself of 20 years before, sharing an astonished recognition of how hard his job as a science fiction author is, because he realized that he probably would have been unable to explain to himself what was going on online just 20 years later.
And I love it because I've read that, and I've read many people express that, and this demand for explainability that we put on ourselves, to me, is one of the things we're going to have to imagine ourselves out of. This is why I have an artistic practice, because I wanted to get over my own need to explain the world to myself. I wanted to just be within that novelty and that creative expansion, and let that be enough. Uh, and I appreciate the sentiment that the creativity of even our little slice of the universe knows no bounds. You cannot explain how we got here. I mean, you can, but it will be a tiny, tiny sliver of the story that actually led us to this point, which is just so cool to me on so many layers.
Now, of course, art is a beautiful way for us to jump over many of these layers. And best art is that which can be interpreted on many layers, and as a consequence speaks to different kinds of people in front of that art or experiencing that art. And we have our cultural and historical memories to be able to build the braids of beautiful stories out of single works of art, whether it's the Odyssey or whether it is Mona Lisa or others that are not necessarily admired by as many people as those, but are not lesser works of art. And that colors our judgment around their meaning, right? And as you said, their explainability. What is your view of explainability and our desire to be able to explain AIs which are famously opaque even to their designers and programmers already, let alone when they are going to be able to autonomously seek goals and modify themselves to achieve those goals? Is that a concern you have, or you are not worried about it?
I have no concern about it personally. I think people will continue to be concerned, but I would challenge them. I go, last I checked, nobody could explain a Van Gogh and its effect on the world. And if you can't explain a Van Gogh, what are your chances of explaining what a self-driving car is choosing to do? Another way to think about it, very few people go home to their dog, or if they're at home looking at their dog right now, and go, tell me why you do what you do. They just enjoy it and embrace it and learn to move through the world with it. The companionship you have with a painting or a dog or another object in your life, or a living thing, or a plant, or a space, very rarely do you value it because you can explain it and you understand it. You value it because it's in the world, sharing the world with you. So to me, the idea that we're going to have trillions and trillions of AIs that need to explain themselves to us, to me is actually an oppressive way to think about it. If you want to make a fragile computing infrastructure, ask it to be explainable. If you want to make something that might adapt to a changing world, make sure that it's creative. And in a lot of ways, asks you to explain yourself. And that doesn't mean make us the slaves to the AI masters. It's we should be explaining each other as we all develop new vocabularies and ways to observe the world we live in. I think that's a healthy way to think about it. But demanding the world be mechanical and explainable, I think has led to many of the fragile things that we have. And I would prefer to live in a world of Van Gogh's expression than one in which we just turn the crank that we understand.
Um, and of course, AIs will agree with you. They will create art that will be having similar effects on their fellow AIs, and there will be layers of expression and self-expression and inspiration and unexplainability that will be naturally and artistically accepted, and that is how I want to end for today our wonderful conversation. I had a lot of fun, and I'm grateful for your quick adhering to this experiment and for making sure that we could share our thoughts with those who followed us. I did share on the various chats the links to Maslow. What is the other URL that maybe you would like me to paste in the chats? Works on Becoming, maybe?
Yeah, throw Works on Becoming.
Okay.
You can get to me. This is what I always tell people: you'll find me. I'm out there. You'll find me.
There you go. There you go. And that is a great way of putting us in front of the world. One of my favorite hashtags is no FOMO, because things happen, and serendipity and synchronicity in a hyper-connected world like ours today are enhanced, and we can count on it working like it beautifully worked tonight with us.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and let me end with our screen share here. This is it.